Okay, so you want to buy a shopping mall. 1 million square feet under one roof, 100 stores paying you rent, a river of shoppers flowing past every one of them from the second the doors open. You don't sell anything. You don't stock a shelf. You just own the floor that everyone else has to stand on, and you collect a check for the privilege every single month. Sounds simple. It is not simple, because a shopping mall is not really a building. It's a machine with one very strange property. It can look completely healthy right up until the week it dies. And the reason why is buried in the contracts, hidden inside the psychology of the hallways, and tied to a single dependency that almost nobody thinks about until it's already gone. Before you make a dollar, you have to survive buying the thing. And the price tag is where the first trap is hiding. Because in this business, two malls that look almost identical from the parking lot can be worth amounts that aren't even in the same universe. People in the industry sort them into tiers. A Class A mall is the good one. Wealthy suburb nearby, a luxury anchor, high sales per square foot, and a waiting list of brands that would kill for a lease inside it. The best of those change hands for well over $1 billion because the income is steady and the tenants are begging to stay. Then you go 2 or 3 tiers down. Older building, weaker anchors, a neighborhood that's thinning out. Some of those have sold for less than the cost of the parking lot. Malls that cost hundreds of millions to build have traded, a couple of decades later, for a few $1,000,000, sometimes less. So here's the first thing nobody tells you when they picture owning a mall. The price isn't telling you about a building. It's telling you what someone believes is about to happen to the town around it. You're not buying square footage. You're buying a bet on a zip code, and the number on the listing is just that bet, written down. Most of the people who actually own malls at scale, by the way, don't own them the way you'd own a house. They own them through a structure called a REIT, a real estate investment trust. A REIT is a company that holds income-producing property and, in exchange for a giant tax break, is legally required to hand almost all of its profit back to shareholders every year. It's why an ordinary person can own a slice of 100 malls for the price of a sandwich without ever once dealing with a leaking roof. The biggest one in America owns or has a stake in a huge share of the country's best malls. And here's a detail that tells you everything about this industry. Back in 2014, that giant took its weaker, lower-tier malls, bundled them together, and spun them off into a separate company so it could keep the crown jewels and let the rest float away on their own. That spun-off company owned more than 100 malls. 7 years later, it filed for bankruptcy. Same original parent, same playbook. The strong kept the strong malls. The weak got cut loose to sink alone. Remember that, because it's the entire story of this industry in one move. Say you've found your mall and the price seems fair. Before you collect a single rent check, there's a layer of costs waiting that ambushes almost every new owner. First, the leases you inherit. You don't get to rewrite them on day one. The anchor stores, the big department stores anchoring each end, often signed deals decades ago at rents that will make you physically wince. And those leases can run for years before you get to touch the number. You inherit whatever the last owner agreed to. Genius or disaster, it's yours now. Second, the maintenance the last owner hid from you. Roofs leak. The systems that heat and cool 1 million square feet wear out. Escalators need constant service. Parking decks crack and crumble. If the previous owner was quietly cutting corners to make the cash flow look pretty on paper, you find out the first hard winner, usually in the form of a repair bill with a lot of zeros. Third, and this is the one that actually sinks people, co-tenancy clauses. These are little phrases buried in almost every store's lease that say, in effect, if a major anchor closes, I'm allowed to slash my rent or walk out entirely. You don't see this cost the day you buy. You see it the day one big anchor goes dark and suddenly a dozen smaller tenants are all legally entitled to pay you less, or nothing at all, at the exact same moment. That's the trap door under the floor. The mall looks fully leased the day you sign, but the whole structure is quietly wired to 1 or 2 boxes at the ends of the building. Pull one out, and the floor gives way under everyone standing near it without you touching a thing. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the way a mall makes money is more layered than almost anyone realizes. The first layer is base rent. Every store pays a fixed amount for its space, priced per square foot per year. A small specialty shop in a strong mall might pay tens of dollars per square foot. The giant anchor at the end of the hall, the one with the biggest sign and the most floor space, often pays a tiny fraction of that. Sometimes a tenth. Read that again. The biggest tenant in the building frequently pays the least per square foot. Why on earth would an owner accept that? Because the anchor isn't paying for space. It's paying with its name. The anchor drags customers through the door, and those customers have to walk past every small store on the way in and back out. The owner isn't renting square footage to the anchor. The owner is renting a crowd from the anchor and paying for it with a discount. And every full-price tenant in the building is, without ever being told, quietly subsidizing that discount. Do the math on it once and it stops feeling like generosity and starts feeling like a hostage situation. The anchor might occupy a third of the entire mall and pay a rounding error in rent. But if it leaves, a third of the building goes dark, the crowd it dragged in evaporates, and the co-tenancy clauses detonate. So the owner keeps signing that terrible deal year after year, not because it's good business, but because the alternative is worse. The second layer is percentage rent. This is extra money on top of the base, tied directly to how much a store actually sells. A store agrees to its base rent, but once its yearly sales cross a certain line, called the break point, the mall takes a small cut of everything above it. Say a store's break point sits at $1.5 million in sales, and in a good year it does $2 million. The mall takes a small percentage of that extra $500,000 on top of every dollar of base rent it was already collecting. When the store wins, the mall wins, automatically, without the owner lifting a finger. The mall isn't just a landlord, it's a silent partner in every register in the building, which also means when sales soften across the whole mall, the owner feels it twice. Once in the vacancies, and again in the percentage rent that quietly evaporates from the stores that stayed. The third layer is called CAM, Common Area Maintenance. This one's clever. It's the tenants paying their share of the cost of running the building itself. Cleaning, lighting, security, keeping the escalators moving, plowing the lot. Each store pays a slice based on how much space it takes up, which means a big chunk of what it costs to physically run the mall isn't paid by the owner at all. It's billed straight back to the stores. Hold on to that because it becomes a weapon that turns on the owner later. And then there's the fourth layer, the one that never shows up in anybody's mental picture. Everything that isn't a store. The kiosks in the middle of the walkway, parking, the ad screens, the pop-up holiday village, the photo booth with Santa. Here's the detail worth stopping on. A little sunglasses cart parked in the dead center of the busiest intersection in the mall might take up less than 100 square feet. And because it sits directly in the path of every human being who walks through, it can be charged more per square foot than a full-size store along the wall. In this business, size and value are not the same thing. Position beats space. The most valuable real estate in the entire building might be a cart selling phone cases. So far, the mall sounds like a machine that prints money from 4 directions at once. Now flip the page over. The costs on the other side are enormous, and here's the cruel part. Most of them don't shrink when business gets bad. Keeping 1 million square feet lit, heated, cooled, secured, and cleaned around the clock runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars a month before a dollar goes toward the loan you used to buy the place. Property taxes on a giant commercial building are one of the largest single-line items of the year. Insurance has been climbing across the whole industry, and none of it cares how many stores are open. Now watch what happens with that CAM bill, the one the tenants pay. Those shared costs don't drop just because part of the mall sits empty. The dark hallway still gets cleaned, the lights over the vacant storefront still burn. Security still patrols the whole building, not just the busy half. So when stores start leaving, that same fixed pile of costs gets split among fewer paying tenants, which means every remaining store's CAM bill quietly goes up. Nothing about the building changed, but staying open just got more expensive for everyone who stayed loyal, which is exactly the kind of pressure that pushes the next few tenants to leave, too. Empty space doesn't just cost you the rent you lost, it raises the price of loyalty for everyone still paying. That's the spiral. and it feeds itself. Here's the trap almost nobody sees coming. Even a mostly full mall can lose money, because it's not really about how many stores are open. It's about who's actually paying. A mall can look 90% occupied and feel healthy from the food court. But if half that space is anchors paying almost nothing, and a growing share of the rest are on cheap short-term deals just to keep the lights on, the real cash flow can be a fraction of what the occupancy number suggests. Occupancy is not income. That gap, the space between how full a mall looks and how much money it actually makes, is where a lot of owners walk straight off a cliff without seeing the edge. Before we get to how malls die, you have to understand something a man figured out almost 70 years ago, because it explains the shape of every mall you've ever walked through. His name was Victor Gruen, an architect who fled Europe before the war, landed in America, and in 1956, in a suburb of Minneapolis, built the first fully enclosed, climate-controlled shopping mall the world had ever seen. Before Gruen, shopping was a street. He put a roof over it, air-conditioned it, sealed it off from the weather, and pointed everything inward. And here's the part that matters. He didn't just design a building, he designed how you move and how you feel inside it. There's a name for the effect that came out of his work: the Gruen Transfer. It describes the exact moment when a shopper who walked in for one specific thing, socks, a phone charger, whatever, gets subtly overwhelmed by the environment and slips into a different state. Wandering, browsing, buying things they never came for. And the environment is built to trigger that on purpose. No clocks, no windows to the outside. Skylights mixed with artificial light so you can't tell how much of the day has slipped away. Anchors placed far apart so you're forced to walk the whole length of the mall past everything in between. A layout just confusing enough that you drift instead of walking a straight line. None of it is decoration. Every corner is engineered to keep your eyes on storefronts a few seconds longer. Here's the twist worth knowing. Gruen came to hate what he'd made. Late in his life, he publicly disowned the shopping mall, said he refused to pay alimony for those bastard developments, and moved back to Europe. The father of the mall spent his final years wishing he'd never invented it. But the machine he built was too good at its one job to stop. Force disorientation, and you increase exposure. Increase exposure, and you increase spending. That is the entire commercial logic of a mall, hidden inside a design that just feels like a nice place to walk around. Now here's the structural risk that runs underneath this whole business, and it's best told through what actually happened to the American mall. For most of the 20th century, the department store was the reason malls existed at all. Developers wouldn't even break ground until they had one or two big anchors signed, because banks wouldn't lend the money without that guarantee of foot traffic. The anchor was the promise the whole building was built on. And then, starting in the 2000s and accelerating hard after 2010, those anchors began dying. Chains that had been the backbone of American retail closed hundreds of stores, filed for bankruptcy, and vanished. And remember the co-tenancy clauses. When one anchor goes dark, it doesn't just remove one rent check. It can legally trigger rent cuts and lease exits for dozens of surrounding stores at once, all because of language written years earlier, back when everyone assumed the anchor would be there forever. Then the internet arrived and finished the setup. For 100 years, a mall's real product was never the stores. It was convenience. If you wanted to compare 5 brands of shoes in one afternoon, the mall was the only place in town that let you do it. That was the whole reason you'd drive across town and pay to park. Online shopping detonated that overnight. Now you can compare 500 options from the couch, have them at your door in a day, and never touch a parking lot. The mall's one advantage, convenience, simply stopped belonging to malls. Watch what that did to the owners. In 2020, as the pandemic emptied the buildings, the second and third largest mall owners in the country filed for bankruptcy within the same few weeks. The next year, that spun-off company we talked about, the one cut loose from the giant back in 2014, filed too, buried under debt it couldn't service on malls that couldn't fill. 3 major mall landlords, gone into bankruptcy court inside about 8 months. And researchers were openly predicting that a quarter of America's malls, possibly half, would disappear entirely within a few years. Not shrink, disappear. To see how that actually plays out, watch one mall live and die from opening day to the wrecking ball. Century 3. Mall opened in West Mifflin, Pennsylvania, just southeast of Pittsburgh in the fall of 1979. And it wasn't some modest suburban strip. When it opened, it was one of the largest enclosed malls in the entire country. Over 1.5 million square feet, 5 department store anchors, more than 200 stores at its peak in the 1980s. It was built fittingly on top of a capped-over industrial slag heap, a monument to the region reinventing itself after steel. For a generation of families around Pittsburgh, this was the place. You worked there, you dated there, you grew up there. In the mid-90s, the biggest mall company in America scooped it up as part of a giant merger and even poured millions into a facelift, new skylights, a modernized center court. On paper, it was in the safest hands in the business. Then the anchors started to wobble. A newer development opened nearby at the end of the 90s and began pulling shoppers away. A competing mall a few miles off renovated and took more. Slowly at first, then not slowly at all. One of the big anchors closed, then another. By the mid-2010s, the losses came in a rush. The Sears closed, Macy's closed, and here's the number that should stay with you. By late 2017, this mall, once one of the biggest in America, was down to around 10% occupancy. The food court that once held more than 20 places to eat was completely empty. The last restaurant standing shut its doors in 2018. Then it stopped being a business and started being a hazard. The heat failed. Sprinkler pipes burst. In early 2019, the building was declared unsafe and uninhabitable, and it closed for good. And that's when the second, uglier life began. An out-of-state investment group had bought it years earlier, promising a grand revival. Instead, the maintenance money stopped. The roof partially collapsed. A fire drew 100 firefighters. A teenager exploring the ruins fell through the roof. Local officials called it a monument to blight and hauled the owners into court. The building that had once been the third largest mall in America was finally condemned, and the wrecking crews moved in. Demolition dragged on for 2 full years. By the spring of 2026, it was gone. 90 acres of empty, cleared ground where a landmark used to stand, waiting for whatever comes next. Keep this in mind if you ever believe that a full mall is a safe mall. Century III was one of the biggest in the country, owned by the strongest operator in the business, sitting on the most stable ground in the region. And it still took the slow walk from pack to rubble. The line between those two states wasn't one dramatic event. It was a sequence of small ones, each one making the next one more likely, until the building was worth less than the cost of tearing it down. So here's the obvious question. If this is how it can end, why does anyone still own malls at all? Because the same forces that killed Century 3 made the survivors incredibly strong. This is that spin-off move again, playing out across the whole country. The weak malls got weaker and died. The strong malls, the Class A ones in wealthy areas, actually got stronger, because when 3 malls in a region die, all their best remaining shoppers and best brands funnel into the one that survived. And the owners who kept their buildings alive did it by changing what they were selling. They stopped trying to cram in more clothing stores that just compete with the internet on price. Instead, they started filling the dead anchor boxes with everything a screen genuinely can't deliver to your door. Restaurants that need a physical table, gyms, medical clinics, and urgent care, which by definition have to exist in a real place. Movie theaters, arcades, indoor attractions. Some malls carved whole wings into apartments, offices, even hotels, turning a single-purpose retail box into a mixed-use property with several income streams instead of one fragile one. The idea underneath is simple, even though executing it costs a fortune. A mall used to sell products. The malls that survived started selling reasons to physically leave your house, reasons the internet cannot ship. So does owning a shopping mall actually work as a business? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on which mall, and the gap between the good outcome and the bad one is staggering. Let me show you both, with the same building, in 2 different years. In the good version, you own a well-placed mall in a growing area. Strong anchors still pulling real foot traffic. A healthy mix of restaurants and services alongside the retail. Low vacancy. Base rent. Percentage rent from stores that are actually selling. And CAM reimbursements all land like clockwork every month. The property holds its value or climbs as the neighborhood around it grows. This is the outcome that turned the biggest mall companies into some of the largest real estate empires on the stock market. This is the version that made fortunes. Now the bad version, same building. One major anchor closes. The co-tenancy clauses fire. A handful of smaller stores renegotiate their rent down, and a few more simply don't renew when their leases end. Meanwhile, your taxes, your insurance, and your utility bills keep climbing because they're tied to the size of the building, not how full it is. The empty anchor box just sits there for a year, 2 years, longer, generating nothing while still needing to be heated, insured, and secured. And that fixed CAM pool now gets divided among fewer paying tenants, so even the loyal stores that stayed are suddenly paying more to occupy a mall with less traffic, which pushes the next few toward the door. The difference between these 2 years, for the very same building, is the difference between a growing asset and a slow-motion demolition. And neither one is exotic. Both happen constantly, sometimes to the same building a decade apart. Century 3 lived the good version first. Packed. Beloved. 200 stores. A regional landmark. Before it slid into the bad version and never climbed back out. The building didn't change. The economics underneath it did. That's the thing to understand about a shopping mall. From the parking lot, it looks like a building full of stores. From the inside, it's a single tightly wired financial organism where every tenant's survival is quietly chained to every other tenant's survival, whether any of them realize it or not. The anchor doesn't just sell clothes or appliances. It sells the crowd that every smaller store depends on to breathe. And when the anchor walks out, it doesn't just leave an empty box. It pulls the crowd out the door behind it. Because in the end, you were never really buying a building at all. You were buying a reason for a crowd to gather. And the day the crowd stops gathering, the most valuable building in town becomes the most expensive thing in the world to walk away from.